Welcome to the video. That's me, also known as That Jiu-Jitsu Guy. Before I was That Jiu-Jitsu Guy, I was an MMA guy. Before I was an MMA guy, I was a guy who had no idea what MMA was. Or maybe I knew what it was, but I never had any interest to watch it. Little did I know that I would go from someone with no experience to becoming a professional mixed martial arts fighter. I get asked a lot how you become a fighter and what it takes, so I'm going to tell you today how you, even if you have no experience at all, how you can become a pro MMA fighter as well. I think the easiest way for me to do that is to just work chronologically and tell you what happened for me. So let's flash way back to May 26th, 2007. You know how in your life there are some moments that you think of as sort of dividing your life into a before and an after? Like there's your life before you got married and your life after, your life before your kids were born and your life after. Well, my MMA and jiu-jitsu journey features 3 of those moments. The first one was on May 26th, 2007. That was the first time I ever watched an MMA fight when my cousin Pat, who also happened to be the best man at my wedding, he took me out to watch this guy named Rampage Jackson knock out Chuck Liddell at UFC 71. Everything before that night would be very different than everything after. We watched that fight and I left thinking, man, the UFC is pretty cool. I'm into this. And because I have an addictive personality and tend to go all in on things pretty easily, I really got into the sport and started watching everything. I actually remember early on into the time when Pat and I were getting into the UFC, he had texted me something about he was out somewhere and heard some UFC nerds talking about something, and I don't even remember what it was, but it's just funny that I do this now and I am the jiu-jitsu and MMA nerd in almost everyone's life that I know. So after a few years of watching MMA and all the pay-per-views and watching UFC Reloaded when they show old fights and even watching the WEC stuff on Versus and WEC Wreckage, if you remember what that was, I thought to myself, you always like playing sports more than watching them, so why not try this? So I figured I would try a jiu-jitsu class just to see what it was like, and I was pretty instantly all in. I never really went in with the intention of being a fighter. I just wanted to see what jiu-jitsu was like because I always found it to be the most interesting part of watching fights. My brother Jeff, this guy right here, he actually just told a story the other day to our buddies about how it was super early on in me training jiu-jitsu, and for any white belts out there watching this, do not do this. But I was young and a white belt and I had no idea. But as Jeff put it, he said, I remember you calling me and telling me you were at like a morning class or something, and some guy was being super rough and aggressive and you were able to catch him in an armbar and he wasn't tapping, so you put it on hard and he had to go to work that day with a sore arm, and you called me and said, yeah, I think I like this thing. So yeah, if you're a white belt and you have something deep and the person isn't tapping, don't do what I did and just put it on harder. But anyway, I trained jiu-jitsu for a while, and then I started also going to the Muay Thai class too, and I really liked that. And then I started working in the sparring with the MMA guys, and before long, I wanted to do a fight. My coach had a pretty good relationship with the local MMA promoter, and we had a few guys at our school who had already fought for him, so he put me on the next card. I applied for an amateur license to fight in the state of Pennsylvania and did some medicals, and boom, I had my first amateur fight a little more than a year after I started training jiu-jitsu. This is where the second one of those before and after moments comes in. The fight was in November, and I actually had plans that I was going to move to Florida with my then girlfriend after the holidays. So I figured I'd do the amateur fight, cross it off the bucket list, and then move to Florida and just continue on with my life. Well, I won my fight via rear naked choke. I'm trying to find clips of all my old fights, and I'm going to maybe go through and do a series where I break down what happened very early on in my MMA career. So if you're not already, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss those videos. But winning that first fight was the best feeling in the world, and I loved it. It was incredible. There is just nothing better than standing in a cage and having a referee raise your hand after a win. A few days later, my coach says to me, hey, they're having another event next month and they want you to fight again. What do you think? I took the fight. I figured I'd fight this one and then still move to Florida. Well, I won the second fight by rear naked choke in like 27 seconds. I push kicked him. He came back in fast, ran right into my right hand that dropped him, and I jumped on his back and choked him out. At this point, I was not moving to Florida. I loved fighting and I wanted to stay to chase what I now wanted to be my career. If I lost that first amateur fight, I would have moved to Florida. I don't know whether I'd be with that girlfriend still or not, but I definitely wouldn't have met my wife since we never would have been in the same city in Philly to meet. And that would also mean that I wouldn't have my kids today. So a definitive before and after moment in my life. I did pretty well as an amateur. I ended my amateur career with 4 wins and 2 losses. And in my last amateur fight, I won an amateur championship. That belt is still at my old school. I wonder if I could get that back, but I digress. I'm going to get into like the schedule and all the training and everything that's required as a pro fighter in a few minutes, so please stay tuned. But as an amateur fighter, it's really different. Kind of. As someone who was just fighting as an amateur earlier in their career, the first few fights, you don't even know if you're good at this yet. So you're not training at the same intensity. I still worked a full-time job, 40 hours a week. I trained once a day, and if I was lucky, I'd be able to get in a run or a lift as well in a day. But as an amateur, you're making $0 to fight. You just can't put the same time in that you can as a pro. And it's not super easy as a pro either, and I'll get there, but at least there's some money on the line and you're working towards making it to the bigger shows. As an amateur, like I said, you don't even know if you're good yet or if you're ever even going to turn pro, let alone make a career out of it. Generally speaking, the schedule for me at this point as an amateur was jiu-jitsu on Monday nights, no-gi and Muay Thai pads Tuesday nights, jiu-jitsu on Wednesday nights, no-gi and MMA sparring on Thursday nights, off Friday nights, no-gi and Muay Thai pads Saturday morning, off Sunday. During the week, if I could, I'd get a run or a lift in, and I would on Friday nights and Sundays always get a run in since I didn't have any other training. So it's still a lot of training time for a hobbyist, but not nearly the pro level, which I will get to. As I started to win more amateur fights, the goal sort of changed from do well as an amateur and win to win enough fights as an amateur to turn pro. As that shift happened, I started to increase my strength and conditioning, and fortunately, a friend of a friend was actually a strength and conditioning coach, and I started to work out with him once a week. If you want to be an amateur fighter, that's what I did and what I think you'd at minimum have to do as well. 4 to 5 trainings a week, plus as much outside conditioning work as possible. But you don't want to be an amateur fighter, you want to be a pro fighter. Every state athletic commission is different. In Pennsylvania, I could have applied for and probably gotten a pro license earlier than I did. There's no set requirement. There's no mandatory amount of fights you need to have before you can turn pro. If you and your coaches think you're ready, you apply for it and that's it. By the time the goal started to be becoming a pro and maybe making a career out of fighting, my coach and I were on the same page. You only get one shot at it. No one gives a shit what your amateur record is, but your pro record is final and does not change. If you turn pro too early and you lose a few fights, those losses never go away. If you're an amateur and your record is 1-6, but you turn pro and you win 10 straight fights, no one cares that your amateur career was bad. I probably had more amateur fights than most guys, but that was on purpose. I started training as an absolute beginner with no martial arts or wrestling experience at all. It was important to turn pro at the right time. After I won the amateur title, I turned pro and I had my first pro fight against a guy you might know named Phil Rowe, who currently fights in the UFC and also did a super fight with Gordon Ryan like a year ago. He's a nice guy and I hope he keeps winning, but it's important for this story, so it can't count as bragging, but I did beat Phil Rowe via unanimous decision and I was 1-0 as a pro. That's sort of where the highlights stop, and we call that foreshadowing. Being a pro now, the lifestyle changed pretty drastically. I always say when talking about this point in my life that as a pro fighter who is still on the regional scene and hasn't made it to the UFC, that you are living intentionally poor. Yes, there are guys who have full-time jobs and still fight in the UFC, but I'm pretty sure if you asked any of them, their training suffers because of working a job like that. As a pro fighter, I worked small part-time jobs and probably only worked around 20 hours a week. I still followed the same schedule I laid out from when I was an amateur, but the conditioning stuff, the extra stuff, that wasn't if I can get it, then I did. It was now mandatory. On top of sport-specific training sessions, I was running at least 5 times a week and lifting 3 times a week. On top of that, I had dedicated sessions with my strength and conditioning coach twice a week. It's between 25 to 30 hours a week of training in total, depending on how long the runs were and how many sparring rounds, etc. It's just what it takes. On top of that, what you get paid for a fight on the local level works out to be literally pennies per hour if you look at how much time goes into each 8 to 12 week training camp. For my first pro fight, I think I made $1,000 to show and $1,000 to win. I think the most I ever made for a pro fight was 2,500 and 2,500 if I won. And that's if you get paid. You only get paid if the fight happens. So if you're training like crazy for 7 weeks and then 1 week from the fight, you or your opponent get hurt and can't fight for some reason, you don't get paid. Signing the contract to fight doesn't put any money in your pocket until you actually are in the cage and the fight starts. It is not an easy way to make a living. But again, that's just what it takes. Just to finish out my fight story, because you've made it this far, I might as well tell you how I got to this point in my life sitting in this chair. I fought all of my amateur fights and my first pro fight at 155, but someone's idea was for me to go to 145 for my second pro fight, which I tried to do. It completely ruined my body and depleted me to the point where I had about 10 seconds worth of energy once the fight started, and I just got pounded on for about 14 minutes and 50 seconds before I lost a decision. Fight number 3, we wisely went back to 155. I felt great in the first round. I thought I won it pretty decisively on the feet. Second round starts and I get caught with a shot and the ref stopped it when I went down. Now I'm 1-2. Fight number 4 is where that third and final before and after a life moment happened. About 10 seconds into the fight, my opponent threw a head kick, which I blocked, but in blocking the kick, my forearm completely shattered. I tried to keep going and I drove him to the cage. I connected my hands for a takedown. And when I pulled his hips, I could feel my forearm move like I had like a second elbow in my arm, and I realized I was in trouble. He tried to come behind while standing to take my back, so I rolled forward for a knee bar. A knee bar he later told me was really close, so that's pretty impressive if I do say so myself, considering how fucked my arm was. But he defended it, and he ended up in my closed guard. I couldn't control the posture because my arm was so mangled, and the ref eventually stopped it after I couldn't defend myself and just was eating shots, and that was the end of my fighting career at 1-3. I had surgery to fix my arm, but it wouldn't heal. I had another surgery and they found a bunch of infection in the bone. I had a third surgery to try and fix it again, which also didn't work. I had a fourth surgery to remove all of the hardware they had put in there since that was causing more infection. And I was left with what is called a non-union fracture, where, just like it sounds, the two ends of the bone won't heal together. It's possible that eventually it did heal together after this many years, and it's also possible that I have a permanent space in my bone where it should be connected, but it's not. I could get an x-ray to find out, but I don't really care. For that reason, I couldn't get a license to fight again, even if I wanted to, which I don't. It's just too late for me. But if I never got my arm broken, I'd never have had to get a real job, which means that my now wife probably would not have said yes to marrying me if I was still forcing her to watch me fight for a living and leading a very strenuous life of training and very little else. That also means that I wouldn't have my 2 kids, which I can't even imagine. So that's before and after moment in my life number 3. Fortunately, my arm healed enough / my body adapted to it enough where I can still train in jiu-jitsu, I can still compete, I can still push myself. It's just not the same 25 to 30 hour a week schedule that I had, but I am very okay with that. Being a pro fighter is really, really, really tough on your body. It's tough on your mind and your psyche, and it's tough on the people around you. You have to be willing to be poor on purpose. You have to be willing to train all the time and to not really do much else in your life. You have to be willing to put most aspects of your life on hold while risking serious bodily injury in order to get a very, very small paycheck. Can you do it if you're a beginner with no experience? Yes, you can, but it will be the absolute hardest thing you ever do in your entire life. I hope this helped any aspiring fighters out there and you enjoyed looking back on my fighting life with me. I don't always enjoy thinking back on it, but it was overall a great part of my life. If you enjoyed this video at all, please do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button and make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Let me know in the comments if you've ever fought MMA and what your experience was like. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the mats.